Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is the 6th annual Edith Chase Symposium. We started off in 2015 was the first one, and if you do the math, you'll realize, well, that's 6 annual things in 7 years. Last year, we had a problem that lots of people had, so we're picking it back up this year. Each year, we gather to commemorate the legacy of our good friend Edith Chase for her significance in bringing her environmental awareness and activity to the city of Kent, to the surrounding region, and to the state of Ohio. Each year, we commemorate Edith's legacy with, first of all, a lecture of a timely topic, and then secondly, with a poetry reading on a related thing. Various topics that we've covered have been things like the problems with Lake Erie's water quality and coastal management of Lake Erie, groundwater problems from fracking activities, and the restoration and control of watershed activities through appropriate vegetation management. Other activities that the Edith Chase Symposium is involved in is we've done guided nature walks to demonstrate watershed management through vegetation. We've also supported the Girl Scouts who are able to earn the Clean Water Steward badge, which includes the Edith Chase name on that badge. Furthermore, we've also published 2 poetry books, and we're currently supporting a pollinator garden near the Kent Chimney Swift chimney that's being constructed near the police station in Kent. This year's theme, as you can see from the screen, is Chasing the Bees. And our lecturer this evening will be Denise Ellsworth, presenting Pollinators in Your Ohio Backyard. And then tomorrow at 4 o'clock, there will be pollination poems Under the Blossom That Hangs on the Bough. And that will be presented at the Wick Poetry Center Plaza, which is adjacent to the College of Architecture and Environmental Design. And over 30 poets will be reading their original materials at that time. So now the question for some of you is, well, if we're commemorating Edith Chase, just exactly who is Edith Chase? And I've asked Bob Wilson to present us a very thoughtful answer to that question. So, Bob?
Thank you, Bob. I'm hoping I'm not muted.
You're not.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about Edith Chase and why we honor her legacy with a yearly symposium. I served for 10 years with Edith on the board of the Kent Environmental Council. At her memorial service, I joked when I thanked Edith's children for loaning us their mother for 50 years. I was really half joking because she did put in about 50 years of service as a local environmental activist. In the mid-1960s, she led an environmental action committee in the Kent League of Women Voters. And by 1970, that group and other community leaders banded together to form the Kent Environmental Council with Edith Chase as the first chairperson. Environmentalism as a political movement was just taking off nationally in 1970, but Edith, the League of Women Voters, and KEC were ahead of the curve. Those of us who attempt to carry forward her work are in awe of what she and her fellow conspirators accomplished. They started one of the first city and county recycling programs in Ohio. They instigated critical improvements in the Kent sewage treatment plant. They turned our neglected riverbanks into River Edge Park, and many more things. Eventually, Edith started our annual River Day celebration, then personally organized it every spring for another 24 years, offering generations of children a natural perspective on the Cuyahoga River. Even as the Kent Environmental Council settled into becoming a local institution, Edith expanded her activity to the regional and national level. She helped Senator John Glenn play a key role in establishing the Ohio Lake Erie Commission and in the eventual ratification of the Great Lakes Compact, which still governs the use of water in the Great Lakes Basin. I could spend a long time listing her many awards, but in all the years I knew Edith, I never heard her mention awards. Past accomplishments were never her focus. She was always looking forward. What do we do next? Might be a fitting epitaph for Edith Chase. Her vision sustained us for many years, and it still does. And like most effective leaders, her approach was fundamentally positive. Environmental awareness can easily devolve into hopelessness. A lot of people look at big problems like mass extinction or global warming and think, what can I do? I'm only one person. Implicit in everything Edith did was her belief that if we work together, we can solve the big problems. When Edith retired from her role as a local activist and moved away from the Kent area, the Kent League of Women Voters came up with the idea of having a yearly lecture in her honor. And they partnered with the Kent Environmental Council to establish the Edith Chase Symposium Association. Our board consists of members from the League of Women Voters and from the Kent Environmental Council. For several years, we were able to consult with Edith on the topics that we would cover and who the speakers would be. She passed away shortly after the 2017 symposium. Our first couple of symposiums, though, she actually helped on. Getting back to her legacy, though, I don't think she was thinking about her own legacy when she interacted with us on these symposiums. I think the source of her enthusiasm was the same spirit that moved her 50 years ago when she saw the need to put our home, our watershed, our ecosystem back into balance. Historically, we think of great American men digging canals and building railroads, dams, and famous bridges, taming nature and conquering wilderness. How fitting then that we should celebrate this woman, our friend and mentor, for leading us towards a reconciliation with nature. Her monuments are cleaner water, cleaner air, trails beside rivers and leafy sanctuaries, a healthier environment for our children. The best way that we can honor Edith's life of service is to pay it forward. Let us be charged with her question, what do we do next? And with next in mind, I'm going to give it back to Dr. Heath, who's going to tell us about our speaker and tonight's program.
Thanks very much, Bob. Very well done. Very much appreciated. Our speaker tonight is Denise Ellsworth. She's in the Department of Entomology at The Ohio State University, and her educational background was she had a bachelor's science degree from OSU in plant pathology, then a master's degree from Ohio State with an emphasis on environmental education. Professionally, she's been a garden writer for the Akron Beacon Journal for 20 years, and many of you may know her already from that activity. Since 2014, she's been the program director of pollinator education at OSU Extension. Her current interests are in the expertise, her current interests and expertise are in wild bee identification, biology and the conservation of wild bees, pollinator habitat conservation, and plant and insect phenology. But those are just stats off of a stat sheet. I think that for me, Denise was so important when last year, partway through some classes that were meeting in person down at Worcester or in Columbus, the pandemic hit. And she had to, within a week, she organized a series of Zoom courses and seminars that kept many of us from going stir crazy during this last wild and woolly year. Denise put together things ranging from Nature's Best Hope on Doug Ptolemy's book of the same name, seminars on bee identification, bee plant interactions, and the phenology of those. Just an amazing thing that I don't know of anybody who could have done it so seamlessly as Denise did. And so it is with considerable pride and gratitude that I present to you our speaker, Denise Ellsworth.
Okay, thanks so much, Bob. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for having me and for welcoming me into your evening to talk about pollinators. And so, what a legacy and what a spirit in Edith, who I was never able to meet, but hopefully all of you will bring that spirit with you as well. I wanted to mention the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, which you've probably heard of. Bob discussed the bigger environmental issues and how we can feel overwhelmed by them. This is our first endangered bee in the continental US. Used to be common in Ohio. I'm hoping maybe someday one of us will find this bee out in our flowers, out in the meadow. Hasn't been seen in Ohio for quite a while. We don't know if this bee is still here, but we're looking, and hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll be looking as well. So what I wanted to do is talk about who some of our common pollinators are, a little bit about some bee habits and some bee habitat, things that you can do in your own backyard. So let's talk about pollinators and why we care. The one thing about Zoom is, especially when you don't have a camera on you, you could be having your dinner right now, and you're certainly welcome to do that. We can thank pollinators for a lot of the foods that we're eating. If you had maybe a slice of pizza today with peppers and tomato sauce, the cheese comes from dairy cows. There's so many of our foods that come to us because of the work that pollinators do. This is an image of a Whole Foods produce section with bees and other insect pollinators and without. So much of the nutritional diversity, the depth in our diet comes to us thanks to pollinators. About 35% of all crops worldwide depends on pollinators. And many of the crops that we're planting more of, think of almonds, think of berries, some of our great vegetables, they need those animal pollinators to transfer pollen from flower to flower. I'll bet lots of you are fans of native plants, and those native plants depend on bees. About 75% of all flowering plants need an insect to move that pollen around. And so we think of pollinators as that keystone species. They're holding the rest of the ecosystem together. So it's not just their food that they're collecting, they're taking this pollen, creating the seeds and the fruits that many of our birds and mammals depend on. They're also a vital part of the food chain. So all of these bees and bats and butterflies are food for someone else, and that's pretty important. So if we focus on pollinators in Ohio, we have, of course, hummingbirds as our pollinators. I'll bet you've seen hummingbirds out there in your landscape, but most of our pollinators are insects. We often think of the honeybee up there in the top middle image, but we have moths and butterflies, flies, all kinds of insects that are pollinators, including down the bottom right, mosquitoes. So many of these insects need flight fuel. They need a little bit of nectar. So they visit flowers for that nectar and inadvertently carry some of that pollen with them to the next flower. So lots of different kinds of insects. Maybe you've seen this on your rose. This is one of my roses that just opened, a big shrub rose. Very simple, very open, 5 petals, full of flower flies. Look at all those little tiny flies gathered there. And so meeting to mate, meeting to find other like-minded species, perhaps to grab a little bit of pollen to ripen their ovaries. All kinds of different creatures can be out there in the garden. Of course, we think of monarchs as that iconic pollinator. We love to see them and watch the caterpillars mature. They're drinking nectar from lots of our flowers. They're not actually seeking pollen. They don't need pollen, but they may inadvertently take some pollen from flower to flower. In Ohio, we don't have bats that serve as pollinators. All of our bats are eating insects, but certainly other parts of the world depend on bat pollinators for many of their crops, like this agave flower. So bees are really our most important pollinators, and we have great bee diversity in Ohio. I hope you've seen lots of bees out in your landscape. Today I saw honeybees. I saw a couple different kinds of bumblebees. I saw a small carpenter bee, a large carpenter bee, which I'm not so crazy about seeing, but they're native bees and they're great pollinators. We think, about 400, maybe 450 different species of bee in Ohio. So more species of bee than we have birds. We have really great bee diversity. Many of them are so small that we don't notice them. Some of our bees are as small as a grain of wild rice. So very hard to see or to identify. And so sometimes we don't appreciate all that bee diversity. What makes bees so special? Well, they're vegetarians, so they need pollen and nectar for food. They have to visit flowers for food. Pollen is the food for the offspring, typically, and the nectar is that flight fuel. And because they need that food, bees are adapted to gather and transport pollen. They have hairy bodies. Their hairs are actually feathery or plumose, and that helps to hold those pollen grains onto their bodies. They have pockets or baskets or places, hairs, sometimes on their bodies where they gather that pollen and transport it. But there's actually one kind of bee that ingests the pollen into its stomach, and then she regurgitates that pollen to provision cells for the young. So there's lots of different strategies that bees can have. Bees are faithful to flowers. You've probably heard this. They tend to visit the same species over and over, the same flower, a flower in the same species over and over. So if they have a favorite flower that they're working, they know how to get into that flower. They know how to quickly find the pollen or nectar, and they keep visiting that flower over and over. It helps them to be more efficient, and it helps the flower as well, so that that flower's pollen isn't wasted on a flower that's not receptive to it. And bees are also out at all different times of the year. So these are queen bumblebees that maybe you saw queen bumblebee out early in your garden, late March, or we had really warm temperatures in April. So many of our bees were active early. Bumblebees overwinter as queens, and then they go off to find, to start a nest. Each one of those queens starts a nest. But we really have bees that kind of span the seasons. Some are active for months at a time. Other bees species may only be active for 3 weeks or so, and then we don't see them as adults until next year. So bumblebees and honeybees are a common type of social bee, but most of the bees on Earth are actually solitary bees. So that means they don't have a queen, workers, and drones. They just have males and females, moms and dads. And of those solitary bees, most are ground nesting. So that's not the same as yellow jacket wasps that nest in the ground, right? That's a social wasp that has a queen and lots of workers angry at you for mowing over top of them. These are solitary bees, so they're just males and females. The males are really just there to mate. And then the female is going in and out of one tunnel entrance. So this isn't multiple insects out of one hole. This is one insect going in and out of one hole. And what she's doing is she's taking food down there, provisioning cells for her offspring. Her offspring then grow on the pollen and nectar that she provides for them, the bee bread, underground. And they actually don't meet their mom. They emerge as adults next year around the same time, so early in the season typically, but they never meet their offspring. So that's why we call them solitary. Besides those ground nesting solitary bees, we have tunnel or cavity nesting solitary bees. Maybe you've seen this little symptom on some of your garden plants. This is my epimedium, but maybe on your roses or on your itea, something that's nice and soft in the garden. This is a bee that actually takes a little bite out of the edge of your leaf, doesn't hurt the plant. The plant has plenty to share. And she rolls that leaf piece up and then she flies back to a cavity or an opening. This could be the bottom of your bamboo wind chimes that are open. This could be some standing stems, dead stems or stalks from last year's plants that this bee may move into the middle of. Again, doesn't hurt the plant. She just needs a cavity or a space. Sometimes people tell me their drain holes in their metal patio furniture is where these little solitary bees will live. And what she does is she makes a little nursery chamber. Each one of these little, what look like cigars or stuffed grape leaves is a little nursery chamber. And in the middle of there is the bee bread, the pollen and nectar, and the offspring. First the egg hatches out and then it eats that bee bread and eventually emerges as an adult bee. There are a lot of different strategies and a lot of different types of substrates that these bees can use. This is the small carpenter bee that I mentioned earlier. So this little carpenter bee doesn't nest in your porch or in your deck or in your soffits like the large carpenter bee. This bee just moves into a hollow stem. Could be a raspberry cane from last year's growth. Could be a fennel stem that she clears the pithy middle out of. And then she gathers pollen and nectar, lays her egg. So this is a piece of a raspberry cane that I cut in half to, the mom was right there watching me guarding her offspring. And I put them all back together and taped them out onto the plant again. But in the middle, what I found was the bee bread, and this is actually the egg. And so that egg hatches out and it matures, it develops, it grows on that bee bread, pupates, and then eventually emerges as an adult. So there are all kinds of dramas and life cycles happening out there that we often don't notice or don't see. Again, this bee is probably about it's a fairly small bee, about a third of the size of a honeybee, kind of drab in color. So it's a bee that we may not notice. We also have this whole group of bees called specialist bees. So about a third of all bees have to have a certain kind of pollen. And this happens to be a specialist on one of my favorite plants, ironweed. So a late season native plant, often seen in pastures, that gets really tall and blooms in purple. But you can see here, this mom is gathering this white pollen from ironweed, and that's the only pollen that her offspring will develop on. So she's perfectly timed to emerge around the time that ironweed is blooming. She gathers that pollen, takes it to her underground tunnel, and provisions cells for her offspring that will emerge then next year around the time that ironweed is in bloom. So about a third of all of our bees are specialists. There are specialists that need blueberries or that need geraniums or they need goldenrod. So it's even more important that all of us include those native plants in our landscapes. So let's talk about some of the things that we can do in our own landscapes to enhance pollinators. Chances are you have at least one flower that has some bees that are attracted to it. So you're helping pollinators. You don't need to have a big meadow. You don't have to have acres of habitat to really help pollinators. Can you grow more flowers for pollinators? Protect that habitat for nesting and resting, reduce or eliminate your pesticide use, and then help other people to do the same. Once you become an advocate, you really have the chance to spread the word and get other people to do what you're doing. So you can add a few flowers in here or there. Usually if we're all in person in 3D, I'd have you raise your hand and tell me if you have a purple coneflower. There's usually one or two people that don't. And then I ask folks to share a purple coneflower with that person. very easy to grow. If you have enough sun, 5 or 6 hours a day, you're going to have lots of flowers on purple coneflower. Very open, very accessible, lots of bees and butterflies, little skippers and flies are going to find those purple coneflowers. So just 1 or 2 plants is really enough to make a difference. That can be in your garden, in your community garden, at church, at the school grounds. So a few plants here and there. Maybe you have some existing garden beds. Can you add in a few plants that are great for pollinators? This isn't my garden, but right now in my garden, my Itea is about ready to bloom. This is a native shrub and has those long arches of blooms, kind of a creamy white that bees will find and feed on. So can you add a few plants in to your existing landscape? Maybe you want to go further and have a dedicated pollinator space, like the Chimney Swift Garden in Kent. And that's a place where we have a concentration of lots of plants that we know are great for pollinators. So there can be milkweeds and Joe Pye weed, bee balms, and an assortment of native, particularly native plants that are great for pollinators in mass and in an arrangement that invites lots of pollinators to come in. Maybe you have a little more space and you can create a meadow. And so do you have even a ½ acre or an acre or more where you can really focus on creating that larger scale habitat for pollinators? And maybe you don't have an acre, but a small meadow, a baby meadow. This is a little patch of meadow. It's about 40 by 40 or so. This is at our Sechrist Arboretum at the OSU campus in Worcester. So it doesn't have to be a large space, but it has that nice diversity of native flowering plants and some grasses that bring in the pollinators, it brings in the birds, and provides that nesting habitat for a lot of species to help them also survive the winter. So when you're planting those plants for your garden, can you include lots of different flower shapes, sizes, colors, and bloom times? Because those different qualities are going to bring different pollinators in. As I mentioned, the butterflies are so interested in pollen, they need a good nectar source. And they also need a place to land, right? They need a landing platform so that they can then uncurl that long tongue and drink out that nectar. Different flower colors are important. We think of hummingbirds and how important those red flowers can be to attract hummingbirds. Of course, the hummingbirds need the nectar, but they also need a protein source, spiders, little insects that they can feed to their young. Different flower bloom times is important. So try to think of spanning the season with bloom. I'll bet you have a lot of trees in your neighborhood that bloom in early spring. So our maples and our willows, very important for those early season pollinators. Think of those queen bumblebees and other small mining bees that are coming out early in the season. We usually don't have a lot of perennials that are blooming that early, but the trees really fill in early in the spring. Kind of spanning the season, now we're into kind of a shrub section of the spring where there are 9-barks and Iteas and roses and lots of other shrubs that are starting to bloom. And then our perennials are really starting to come in strong. Those will carry us all the way through the summer into the fall with things like asters and goldenrod. So when we can really plan out that bloom to have that span of bloom throughout the season, we're inviting lots of different, not just bees, but other pollinators to come, butterflies, beetles, wasps to come visit those flowers. Can you plant in drifts or masses? I forgot to mention that really incredible pollinator garden. That's the butterfly garden at Holden Arboretum. And this image is also from Holden Arboretum. If you've never been to see their butterfly garden, it's so amazing. It's definitely worth a trip. Their staff is just incredible. Have a lot of assortment of different plants. They do some plant trials up there. So wonderful to see what they do. So if you plant in drifts or masses, that helps bees. Remember, I said they wanted to be faithful to flowers. They want to visit the same kind of flower over and over. This helps bees to be more efficient when we can put a big mass of, for example, mountain mint in. This is one of my favorite native perennials, mountain mint. It's going to bloom for weeks at a time. It has a tiny, tiny little mint flower on it, but kind of in a flat-topped cluster. but it provides lots of nectar over a period of several weeks. So you get a lot of different kinds of pollinators coming to visit that mountain mint. But having those drifts or masses helps our pollinators to be more efficient so that the bees can get everything they want, leave, take the load, and come back and get some more. I mentioned the importance of native plants when I talked about the specialist bees, but it's not just those specialists. So pollinators and their plants have evolved over eons, and they've evolved so that the plants are offering the antioxidants, the vitamins, the amino acids, the specific ingredients and nutrients that pollinators need to develop in a healthy way. And so by providing those native plants in our landscape, we're really giving our pollinators the best food, exactly what they need. When we plant some of our introduced plants, in a way, it can be sort of like the Gatorade and the Doritos, right? Some nutrition is there, but maybe not the best nutrition for those pollinators that we're trying to bring in. So I like a mix of plants. I'm not saying you have to plant only native plants, but plant a few more native plants that'll really target the nutritional needs of those native pollinators. Now, I know you probably have a few weeds, and I'm here to tell you that lots of your weeds are really important for pollinators. So early in the season, I have a little patch of purple dead nettle. This is the weed that grows over farm fields in spring, kind of turns everything a shade of purple. You've probably seen that. This is a little winter annual, so it sprouts when the soil is cold and forms these little tiny pink or purple flowers that in the mint family, little drinks of nectar in there. And so what we see with this purple dead nettle is that a lot of our early season bees are finding these flowers. This is blooming in March and early April, but these bees are finding those flowers and taking that nectar drink. So allowing some of those weeds to go ahead and bloom. I think a lot of us know how important dandelions can be. In the bee world, we call this part of the spring yellows. So the dandelions and the mustards are really important as nectar and pollen sources for those early season bees. Right now in my garden, my red clover is just starting to bloom. That's a taller clover with a bigger head than our white clover. Maybe your white clover is blooming as well. Honeybees tend to like white clover. The red clover has a longer flower. If we think about the little individual flowers on that flower head, red clover has longer flowers, and honeybees, although they have long tongues, they're not quite long enough to really take advantage of that red clover. So you'll tend to see a lot of bumblebees on red clover. They have longer tongues, and a lot of honeybees on that white clover. So even if, maybe you're like, I can't have clover or dandelion or other weeds in my front yard, maybe you allow some of those weeds to grow in the backyard. So the bees are really foraging. They have a lot of food there in the backyard, but you still have that, kind of neighborhood appropriate look if that's what you're going for in the front yard. Later in the season, I have lots of asters in my yard. They're a great plant for later in the season. So think of September, October, even into November. I've had bumblebees foraging on my asters as late as Thanksgiving. And often those are male bumblebees. They never go back to the nest once they leave. They're just kind of hanging out waiting for a virgin queen bumblebee. And so they're out there as long in the season as they can bear the cold. So those asters can provide them a little bit of flight fuel to keep them going. So rethink those weeds. They really can serve a good purpose. Don't include some of those invasive weeds, honeysuckles, autumn olive. Those tend to outpace our native plants, but there are good places for some weeds, a good excuse to be a little more tolerant with weeds. Think about natural nesting sites. So I'm not a huge fan of bee hotels. If you have one, no judgment. It's okay to have a bee hotel, but they're really not the best habitat for our native bees. Our native bees like to spread out. They like to nest naturally in rotting woods, in broken stems, in cut flower stalks. And these bee hotels tend to focus too many bees in one small space where diseases and pests can build up. So I'd rather see you protect some bare soil if you have some of those solitary nesting bees. Can you protect the site where they're living and nesting? Or can you allow some of those stems to stand in the garden? So that small cavity nesting bees or little solitary tunnel nesting bees can move in. My practice now is to leave my perennials up until March and then cut them back about knee height. It's the cut stem that the new bees emerging this year can move into and nest in. They don't get back in and harm the plant at its base. They just move into the stalk there. So it really doesn't hurt your plants. Those stalks naturally fall over in time. And so there's not a lot of chance for buildup of diseases or something that we call pollen mites. Those are little mites that eat the pollen. They eat the baby food and they steal it from the baby bees. So can you protect that natural soil? Can you allow some of those natural nesting areas? It also means maybe being a little bit messier in our landscapes as far as leaving some leaves. Many of our butterfly or moth species need those leaves that may be good overwintering substrate. Our queen bumblebees, when they're looking for places to nest, they like to root around those leaves to find little abandoned mouse holes or other dark places to start their colonies. So allowing the leaves to be there in the landscape. And it's also great for your garden soil. It really builds your garden soil. And then can you reduce or eliminate pesticide use? We used to talk just about insecticides because, of course, insecticides harm insects, but we're finding now that miticides or fungicides can also have effects on some of our other pollinators. So even though a fungicide isn't killing a bee, just like when a person takes an antibiotic, it affects our whole microbiome. When a bee is coated with a fungicide, it doesn't kill the bee, but it can change the microbiome of the hive or the environment for the offspring. So really thinking carefully about what products we decide to use. I'm using an integrated pest management approach, choosing products that are safest for bees, or using alternative methods such as handpicking or beneficial insects to help with some of our pest problems. And then finally, spreading the word. Can you help other people know how important pollinators are and how really with just a few steps you can make a difference? Adding a few of those plants into your landscape, helping folks get out there, maybe in a meadow like we are here with some nets and a camera and some vials, taking pictures of what we're seeing to help other people identify and study which pollinators are we finding across Ohio. So for this season, is there one thing that you can do to help pollinators? Maybe that's planting one purple coneflower or sharing your purple coneflower with a couple neighbors who maybe don't have as many plants that the bees would like. Here I mentioned one of my favorites, the mountain mint. Maybe you can find mountain mint and incorporate this into your own landscape. It's also great for, it has a wonderful minty smell, but it doesn't spread underground like peppermint or spearmint. So a really nice addition to landscapes. And you'll be amazed how many pollinators will come and visit this plant when it's in bloom. There are lots of places you can go to learn more about pollinators. We have two wonderful nonprofits in the US that focus on pollinator issues. You probably know the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and also Pollinator Partnership. So both of these organizations have fact sheets and webinars, lots of great plant lists and other resources to help you easily make that shift from maybe not a lot of habitat to lots of great plants and other habitat ideas to encourage pollinators. I'm at the beelab.osu.edu. That's our Ohio State University Bee Lab. And on that website, I've tried to collect lots of resources for you. Again, plant list. We have a webinar series. And actually, we're trying to recruit more bee enthusiasts who want to help by observing bees, by taking pictures of bees, and helping with community science. So visit that Bee Lab website under our workshops and webinars and find out about how you can participate in some of our free webinars. We also have lots of webinars that are recorded there, and you can access those on our website. So thank you so much for inviting me in and giving me a block of time to talk about pollinators. I'd love to spend even more time with you. In fact, I hope you'll invite me to your garden group, to your Audubon group, to other groups that might be interested in learning more about pollinators. I'm hoping that the next time we see each other, it can be 3D. I'm ready to be with groups again and be out there looking at flowers and looking for bees, and would love to talk to your group. So you can contact me at the email on the screen. So my Zoom mates were quite quiet tonight. Zoe on the left and Ringo on the right, who've been here in the Zoom room with me for over 16 months now, adapting really well to their Zoom environment. So again, thanks so much for inviting me. And if we have questions, I'm happy to take those.
Thank you very much, Denise. As always, you get the juices flowing. I feel like I should run out and plant some coneflowers while the sun is still up. But yeah, I should mention to everybody that Denise always gets me enthused. I took a one-day course or something, I volunteer pollinator enthusiast or something like that. And I got so enthused, I took Denise's year-long course. Towards the end of the course, I was starting to figure out what I should have learned at the beginning of the course, so I took it again. And yeah, I haven't looked back. It's wonderful, Denise, always to hear you talk and present these things. We have time for some questions, and so just put those in the chat box, and we'll try to field those. I see, let's see, this is from Lynn Vogel. Lynn, do you want to offer this yourself, or would you like me to read it?
You can just go ahead and read it.
Okay, I will. This is from Lynn. From the Portage County Soil and Water Conservation District. She wants to offer each participant a native plant for their attendance. So email her at lvogel at, that's LVOGEL, at portageswcd.org. And she will arrange to get a plant to you. Mostly shrubs and trees are available. So that's a little extra thing. We just, it's a surprise gift, and there is no gift more welcome than a surprise gift. So you have that. Just contact Lynn for
Thanks,
that.
Lynn. I just sent you my email. Thank you.
Okay.
We have a question.
You, Denise, I really do. It's looking good too, girl.
Several people are asking where they can get mountain mint. Can they get it at their local garden store? What do you think, Denise?
So for a lot of these native plants, I'll just go back even 5 years ago. It used to be a lot harder to find these native plants, but there are more and more plant nurseries that are focusing on natives. And if you go to the LEAP website, and maybe guys, if someone knows that website, they can put that into the chat box. I don't have access to it, to the chat box right now. The LEAP website is a consortium of Northeast Ohio and Pennsylvania groups, and they have a map on their website where you can see all the different plant nurseries and then visit their websites and see what plants they offer. And there are quite a few pins on that map in Northeast Ohio, so we're really lucky. If you happen to be going down into Central Ohio, around the Delaware area, there are a couple native plant nurseries as well, many in the Cincinnati area. And then a lot of your nature centers now are offering, maybe just a dedicated plant sale in the spring, but others may have a small greenhouse where they can sell plants throughout the year. So I would definitely check out that LEAP website and also ask around closer to you. And of course, Lynn mentioned the Soil and Water Office in Portage County. Lynn just does an amazing job focusing on a lot of wonderful trees and shrubs that are natives for wildlife, for pollinators. And so definitely get involved in that plant sale next year.
We have another question. Someone asked, they said they have a lot of clay in their soil. Do you have any recommendation for what they might grow that pollinators might like?
Sure. So one of the things I really like to advise people is to look around and see what kind of grows naturally in your area or what grows well in your neighborhood. You know, maybe a neighbor has success with a certain plant, and that would be a good one for you to try. Or if you're looking for native plants, you know, see what's kind of growing in meadows or roadsides by you, because it might give you a clue for what might do well in your own landscape. The good news about natives is that they don't tend to prefer rich soils or fertile soils. A lot of them are used to, you know, really tough sites, not a lot of water, not a lot of nutrients. So many of these native plants will do well in sites that aren't as lush, that might be what we think of as really ideal garden soil. And as Doug Tallamy, who's one of my favorite lecturers and authors, says, you know, try a bunch of different plants. Some things are going to work well for you, and then go with what's working for you. Divide those and add more of those. Others, you know, you try a plant several times, it doesn't work, maybe move away from that plant. In Bob's background, he had a beautiful rhododendron. They just don't do well on my site, but I can grow Itias really well. I can grow 9-bark. And so I kind of go with what I'm successful with.
Denise, we have a question here that Trish McLaughlin has heard recently that bees are gathering microplastics along with pollen. Have you heard anything about that?
I really haven't heard about the microplastics as a pollen, but I have heard about for example, the leaf-cutting bee. There have been some leaf-cutting bee nests that these little nest cells that the leaf-cutting bee has taken little discs of plastic. So it does tend to be inert. It hasn't so far been identified as an issue, as a health issue for these bees. It just happens to be something in the climate. So bees will gather all kinds of things that seem like pollen, that you know, are of a similar size, granular. And so maybe you've seen honeybees around your bird feeders in late winter and early spring before there really even is the purple dead nettle blooming. The honeybees are there, and they're kind of digging around looking for that corn, that fine corn dust from the birdseed. Sometimes honeybees will visit flour that happens to be flour, that happens to be outside, or drywall dust, or anything that, you know, their instinct is to collect that dusty stuff, which is why insecticides that are dust formulations are especially difficult, harmful to bees. And so I haven't heard about the microplastics necessarily of bees collecting those instead of pollen. So think of that just kind of like junk coming along that doesn't add to the nutrition of what the bees need.
Bob, do you see any further questions?
No, I don't.
Don't either. Well, let's. Well done.
There's something in Q&A. How do bees and ants communicate, or do they?
Oh.
Wow. So we have how many hours left, Bob? So just really basically, we have those social bees like bumblebees and honeybees, and then we have solitary bees. So the social bees are communicating in lots of different ways. They're communicating through pheromones, through hormones, scents, and smells in the colony. Even the smell of nectar and the smell of pollen is a way that bees can communicate. Of course, honeybees are using the waggle dance to communicate with their sisters to find food sources. Bumblebees don't dance, but they can sniff each other's feet and tell where they've been, which flowers they've been on, and that's a way that they can communicate where the food sources are. Our solitary bees aren't communicating much, but even on a flower, different bees visit, different pollen is left, and those stinky feet of all those bees have been there, and bees are picking up those olfactory those characteristics and using them to make decisions about where to go or where the food sources might be. So lots of different ways that it's really fascinating, the ways that the bees are communicating.
Thank you.
Well, we could go on, but we probably need to close this out. We are recording it, so people will put a link on our Edith Chase site so that you can view this over and over again if you wish, or tell your friends to view it. Let's see if I can share my screen. Let's see.
Stop there, Bob. There you go.
Okay, I can share my screen then. Okay, let's do this one.
We're getting a lot of remarks, Denise, thanking you. And I thank you too. It was very informative. We learned a lot.
Great, thanks.
We're
everybody.
in the process, so good information.
As always.
Let's see, one thing that as we close, I'd like to remind people that this is really only the first half of the 6th annual Edith Chase Symposium. Tomorrow at 4 p.m. in the Wick Poetry Center, there will be Under the Blossom That Hangs on the Bough. And you can get in free if you can tell us which Shakespearean play that line comes from. Oh, but wait, you don't have to strain yourself because it's free and open to everybody. The Wick Poetry Center is adjacent to the College of Architecture and Environmental Design, the new platinum orange building on the KSU Esplanade. I would like to, in closing, recognize the organizing committee that really we spend nearly a year putting these things together. You wouldn't think it would take that long, but it really does. And in particular, I want to thank our sponsors who have sponsored this. Naturally, I want to thank the Kent Environmental Council and the League of Women Voters of Kent, who were both initiated by Edith Chase and were initiators of this program. We have a number of other sponsors, and in particular, I want to recognize the family of Edith Chase that has generously supported us, as well as the friends of Edith Chase. And Edith had many, many friends, and they have stepped up to help promote this program and our activities in the community. If you would like to join us and help support us, please visit our website, edithchasesymposium.org. And without further ado, then I'm going to thank Denise once again, and Bob Wilson for his very thoughtful comments on Edith's legacy, and Lynn Vogel for the plants that we can all pick up. So thank you, everyone, for choosing to be with us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed presenting it. Thanks, you.
Everybody. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thanks very much. Good night.
Good night.